To make the link between the real business world and academic world, we now have Professor Franklin Allen, who's the director of the Brevan Howard Centre in Imperial College Business School. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I want to start by taking off from what was discussed this morning in the Capturing Growth session. And that was the statement by Carsten Loeffler from Alliance that in the end they have to make a commercial return. And things have to be profitable. So what does that mean? Well, the way we teach it in most business schools is to come up with a commercial discount rate. And the way we do that is we look at the stock market to get an opportunity cost. And typically the way we capture the way the stock market works is a simple asset pricing model like the capital asset pricing model, which is now over 50 years old. And that adjusts for what we call systematic risk. It has a risk-free component, and then you have a risk premium, and that risk premium depends on the riskiness of the business that you're investing in. We use beta as a proxy for that, which is based on the correlation with the stock market. So we diversify risk, get rid of all the unique risk, and end up with this systematic risk. Now, at the moment, risk-free rates in most countries in the world are very low, in many places around zero, in some countries even negative. But you still have the risk component, and the kinds of risk premiums that people typically use are 6–7%. So if you're in a business which is roughly the same as the stock market, you are using discount rates 6, 7, 8, 9%, depending on where you're at. So these are fairly high rates. And what it means is that you have a big bias towards cash flows which are close in, and ones which are more than 15, 20 years away basically don't count at all. Now, when people talk about climate change, there's a big issue about what discount rate to use. So in the Stern report, for example, they take the traditional British economist view, which is if you're talking about intergenerational things, there's no reason to discount future generations at any rate that's different from the current generation. So they use very low discount rates. If you do it in terms of the intergenerational weighting, it's 0.1%. If you do it over the general time, it's about 1.5%. But clearly there's a big difference between this 1.5% and these commercial rates, which businesses often use. Now, a number of other economists argue, well, you shouldn't use these low intergenerational rates, you should use market rates to discount climate change projects. And that's a very interesting debate, and we could spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to take it as given that in this audience we use the Stern kinds of numbers. So if you've got social discount rates which are very low compared to commercial rates, then you're going to have a problem sourcing finance, because there are going to be lots of projects which socially are very worthwhile, but at a private level they're not worth funding. So this is somewhat different than what David was talking about. So clearly there's a lot of scope for the kinds of things that they're doing, but there's still going to be lots of projects which are socially worthwhile but not commercially worthwhile. And the question is, what should we do about that? Well, the stand answer is, well, the government should step in and do it. So if you think about things like solar or wind, those kinds of renewables, which are very pertinent, those are things which it's often argued should be subsidized by the government. Now, there are good reasons to do that. There are tremendous learning effects. So this morning, Gabrielle was talking about the fact that solar in many parts of the world is now on a par with other kinds of energy generation. That's because the cost of solar has gone down dramatically. The more you do it, the cheaper it becomes. Now, the problem with those kinds of things like subsidies is you have to raise taxes to provide the money. That's very expensive in terms of distortions and so on. So I think it's very important that we look farther than just having the government come in and subsidize things. And what I want to do in the few minutes that I have is talk about some of the innovations that have been used to try and overcome those problems and use government resources and private resources more sustainably, more efficiently than has been done in some of these areas to date. Now, one very successful example is what called state revolving funds. And these result from the 1987 US Clean Water Act, Federal Clean Water Act. And what had happened before then was if the federal government wanted to try and have an environmental project to clean up the environment, it would just simply give a grant. The local government or the state government would then just spend the money and then it was gone. And the idea they came up with was, let's try and do something a little bit different than that. Instead of just giving a grant, let's make a loan, and then the local governments can use private sources of funds plus tax funds and so on, and we can create a revolving fund. And this idea has worked very well. So, for example, many states have used these to have clean water projects. It's created a lot of employment. So the EPA, for example, has argued that this program has, between 1987 and 2005, created over 700,000 jobs in the US, as well as having all these environmental positives. A second one, which is an interesting one, which is directly related to climate change, is debt for nature swaps. So what are they? Well, these are examples where developing countries have had debt problems, and what's happened is that NGOs, and in some cases governments, have stepped in and they've bought up the debt of these countries. And what they've done is then go to the governments of the countries and said, look, if you take certain environmental actions, then we will write off your debt and you won't have to pay it. So one of the first examples of this was the case where one of these NGOs went to Bolivia. They bought up a fair amount of Bolivian debt at low values, low market values, because the country has issues of whether they could pay it or not. And they said, if you set aside 3.7 million acres for the Beni Biosphere Reserve, we'll cancel your debt. And that deal went through, and as a result, this biosphere, which, as I understand it, was to a large extent forests and things, was sustained. And there have been many other examples of rainforests and so on around the world, Jamaica, Guatemala, various other countries where these kinds of deals have gone forward. Let me finish with a third one, which comes from medicine. And medicine has a lot of similar problems to the kinds of issues as climate change. If you look commercially at drug development, what is going to make money is things like lifestyle diseases like statins or cholesterol, as they call it in the US, things that get you to live longer and healthier lives and so on. But the real problems in the world are in emerging economies where there are killers diseases which kill millions of people. So one example is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was solved as a problem in the developed world after World War II with the development of antibiotics and things. But in the developing world, it's still a major problem. It kills, on average, about 1.7 million people a year around the world. So it's a major killer. There are treatments, but they're very old ones based on treatments that were used after World War II in the developed world. It's not worth developing these things commercially. But clearly, on any kind of ethical basis, this is what we should be doing, is developing these kinds of treatments to save lives, particularly from very nasty diseases like tuberculosis. So one of the ideas that came up was to develop something called the Deep Tbd Alliance. And this was a combination of Bayer with the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and governments as well. These drugs have some commercial potential, but it's not enough to make them attractive. But by combining foundation money together with government money and the commercial potential, Bayer was able to help develop drugs that led to new cures and so on. So I think there is huge potential for combining different kinds of ideas of innovating finance. You don't just need the government to go in and finance things, which is the traditional solution. And this is very important for climate change. So let me stop there and hand over.
Thank you, Franklin. So we have a bit of time for some questions. Yeah.
You're talking about adjusting the discount rate. Is the answer not also to adjust what's above the line, which is basically the cash flows, and say you need to take into account not only profitability but also social impact or environmental impact, and that changes the profitability and the present value of any project?
So yes, certainly that's what's happening. The question is how you actually deal with that. So to get private money, though, if we're thinking about what was Allianz, the person from Allianz was talking about, they need to make a commercial return. And to do that, they have to either take a lower rate. They can't have this luxury of saying, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to take a 2% return when similar kinds of risk projects are generating 8 or 9%. So somebody has to come in and step that up unless we have some kinds of regulations which says they need to do something, a particular proportion of their financing or something like that. So there are different ways to do it, and there are lots of government policies that can do that. Subsidies is the one that people use as the obvious answer. But I think what we need to do is think about other innovative ways of doing things. And some of the ideas you're having as well, shouldn't we have forced businesses to take into account those kinds of things? That's what regulation does, essentially. That's another way of going. I think the advantage of these kinds of ones is that there are a lot of people who want to contribute money to solve social problems like the Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. And so that money's already out there. We know how that works, and these are good ways to do that. That's not to say there aren't many other ways. And one of the things that we try and do here at the Brevan Howard Centre at the Business School is try and think about these kinds of innovative financing ways.
Thank you very much.